Hello, welcome to the Learning Curve podcast. I'm Tapaswini Punna, doctoral student from the Department of Educational Psychology at University of North Texas. I'm here with your host, Dr. Darrell Hull.
Hey, hi everybody. Yeah, thanks for that, Tapaswini. This is our maiden voyage here on the Learning Curve podcast. It's kind of exciting. I hope what we're starting here is going to support some pretty helpful interactions that reveal what we do in education, research, and evaluation.
Yeah, these podcasts are all about helping bridge the gap between the researchers and educational practitioners. The Learning Curve podcast is an extension of our newly formed Trend network. For those who don't know what Trend stands for, it is Texas Research and Evaluation Network for Development. Trend is made up of educational researchers and practitioners such as school administrators, teachers, policymakers like school board members, and others that are interested in improving how research informs practice. We help make the link so to speak.
Yeah, that's right. So just like you said, Tapaswini, we're trying to improve relationships, with them and break down barriers that prevent researchers and practitioners from working together. The practitioners are the people that really know schools and need answers to their questions about what they should be doing to improve learning, to improve in school environments. And what we really want to do is encourage people to work together more. That's why we call this podcast The Learning Curve, because we need to learn from each other, to really improve educational research and set us on kind of a growth pathway. So, and I think that's especially true in North Texas. The North Texas region's got like 50 school districts and multiple institutions of higher education that are full of researchers. And it just doesn't seem like we collaborate nearly enough. And in my conversations with other researchers, they agree. They would really like to have the opportunity to work with educational practitioners more. And I think practitioners, when I speak to them, they say the same thing. So,
It is a common misconception that educational researchers know what research questions to ask. Some of them, as they have worked in the teaching field, they might have known, but most of them don't. So maybe they don't ask the right questions or aren't precise in the way they have to ask the question. But we know there are a lot of unanswered questions out there that real educators don't answer to.
yeah, that's 100% true. In addition to that, I think there's also this difficulty of communicating results of research to practitioners, at least in ways that they can effectively use those research results.
Precisely. How can we expect educational practitioners to use research findings when those findings pretty much exist solely in journal articles? It just isn't very accessible.
That's true. We tend to write in our journal articles for other researchers, and we don't write those findings up for people to use a lot of times. So hopefully this trend network that we're starting can support conversations and some exchange in the ways that are more mutually beneficial for researchers and practitioners, because we both need each other if we want to improve schools and we want to improve learning opportunities for everybody.
Well, we are pretty fortunate today because we happen to have as our guest a very approachable researcher, I think. It's not always easy to find a quantitative methodologist that welcomes questions of all kinds. So I'm really interested to hear what he will say today. Our guest today is Dr. James Uanhoro. He's an assistant professor in research methodology, measurement, and statistics program here at University of North Texas. And he's a PhD graduate from Ohio State University. He's a brilliant researcher with expertise in multi-level regression models, Bayesian data analysis, and developing accessible statistical tools for researchers. Dr. James, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tapaswini and Darrell, for inviting me. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy. I recently reviewed your Vita, and man, you've been right at it. I mean, it's good. I got to say, I was really impressed with a lot of your latest work. I mean, you've got pretty recent papers in Journal of Educational Psychology. I think it was a paper on longitudinal growth of vocabulary and bilingual learners, and then in contrast to that, you've got recent methods papers and behavior research methods on meta-analysis SEM or meta-analytic SEM, and then I think you got one in the SEM journal on Bayesian SEM with correlation matrices. Geez, dude, it's a lot, and I don't think that's even the tip of the iceberg. I mean, to be honest, I was really taken aback. I mean, I don't know how you do it. It's like 14 papers or something like that you've published just in the last 2 years, and you're lead on quite a lot of them too. I mean, how do you do it?
Well, I generally have 2 tracks of publications. There are those that I consider my own work. So they are more methodological papers. Basically, I have some methodological question. How does a particular analysis work? Under what conditions does it work? Under what conditions does it fail? So with this kind of framing, those are the kinds of questions I tend to answer, and sometimes developing new methods. And those papers, I don't have to rely on like human data collection. The data are made up on my computer, and I analyze them on my computer. So my speed depends on how much I work on them. So that I think generally methodologists are sometimes able to publish papers at a faster rate than people who have to collect data from the real world, and you depend on what happens in the real world. So I know a lot of my colleagues, for example, their research was slowed down by COVID, and that's not really a factor for the papers that I consider my paper, because I don't have to go into schools and all of that.
Yeah, but at the same time, if you're making this has got to be a point of confusion amongst people. So
Okay.
If you're making up data, how can you really say that that's research? You're just making the data up. This is This is the idea behind simulation study, right?
Yes.
So explain to how this works. Going.
So when we do simulation studies, we are asking questions about the methods. How do the methods behave? So to know how a method behaves, when does it behave well, you have to know everything about the data the method is interacting with. I'll give an example. Let's assume we have a group of people and their average height is 1.5 meters, or I don't know, 5'7".
Okay, that works better for me.
Pretty much me.
Thank you.
So we have this group of people, and someone says, I'm going to propose a new method of calculating the average. Now we have to verify if this method works. So ideally, if we use this method to calculate the average, it should give us 5'7". That's the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in research, if you've done research, there's something called a sampling variation. The basic idea is if I have a question for this group of people, what's their average height? Usually, we have these questions about large populations, so let's make it more practical. For students at UNT, what's their average height? So one way you can go is to say, I'm going to examine every single student at UNT with a tape rule and calculate their average height.
Okay.
Then your researcher is going to tell you that's inefficient. We don't need every single person. Let's just get a small group of people. But the problem with a small group of people is they don't reflect the exact average height. So when you have a small group of people, you don't really know the truth. You have an approximation to the truth. So when I'm doing studies and I want to check, does this method give us the exact average height? I need data where I know the truth about every single person
I see.
in the study, every single person. And the only way you have that data is to make it up.
Gotcha.
So I make up data where the true average height is 5'7". And then in that data set, I pull out 10 people. And I check, how well does this method work for this group of 10 people and another group of 10 people from this data set where I know the true average height. So the issue is we need to know the truth to examine whether a method can yield the truth. And the only way to know the truth is either to, be a billionaire and recruit everyone in the world or to make up your own data where you know the truth behind the data.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
So, but you also work with real data too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So usually those are in the context of collaborations with, well, from my own language, I say substantive researchers. But someone told me once that everyone is a substantive researcher. But those are in the context of collaborations with researchers who have questions about the real world, mostly in education. So I have a long-term collaborator, for example, who studies child language development. And so in these studies, she's mostly concerned with gathering the data and designing the studies. And I have some input in that. And then on the back end, after the data are collected, then I do the analysis.
Yeah.
I have a collaborator who works in fashion, studies transparency in the fashion industry. And now I know a few things about fashion. I know Balenciaga, for example.
No what?
Balenciaga, that is a
Okay.
brand.
Oh.
Or Yves Saint Laurent. So yeah, I know a few things about fashion. I know a few things about mental health. I'm learning a few things about Alzheimer's disease. And that's because I work with people who study these topics as their substantive topics. And I'm usually in there analyzing data, asking them some clarifying questions, trying to extract insights from data.
Yeah, this is going
Yeah.
to be a new thing. I mean, amongst research methodologists to become a fashion icon. Yeah. I don't know that I've thought of you in that context before.
No. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, like well, I'm wearing my UNT shirt and some random non-fashionable clothes, but yeah, now I know I can tell one brand from the other. What's a fast fashion brand? What's a mass market brand? What's a luxury brand? Because well, when you look at data sets filled with brands for hours and hours and hours, you start to learn something about the real world also. Yeah.
That's good. You're going to have to teach me. I'm going to learn more than methods from you. Yeah, so, I mean, I got to say, man, it's got to keep you really busy. I mean, I don't know where do you find the time to work on all these things?
It depends semester to semester. There was a time when I would wake up really early, so I'd wake up by 4 a.m., get quite a bit of work done, and because no one else is communicating with me, it's just easy to just cover quite a bit.
Nobody's communicating because they're sleeping.
Yeah, they're sleeping.
Yeah.
yeah. So like 4 to 8, no one's communicating with me. There are no emails. And by 8 o'clock, like I've got a whole lot done. So then I go into the office and, well, people start to show up, their questions, their emails.
Yeah.
But I feel like I've done enough with that day already that even if I'm not able to work on my research the rest of the day, then I've done a fair bit. And there are other times I try to like block days of the week. If I can reserve some days, try and minimize meetings on those days. That helps also.
Yeah, I'm kind of like that myself. Once I get started working on something, I binge work on it. I will get into a flow state, and because it's hard for me to get into that flow sometimes. But once I get in, I don't want to interrupt. I just keep working. So, yeah, middle of the night stuff. It's my game too, man. Clearly, I'm getting more sleep than you, though, man, because many papers as you're publishing, I'm getting a lot more sleep.
It's funny. I don't know. I went to boarding school at 10, so 6 hours of sleep is what I've been sleeping for decades now. And I can't get more than 6 hours, really. So, it makes it a little easier.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I do want people to get to know you a little bit more because I feel like one of the things about methodologists, people are afraid of us because they're like, these people do statistics. It's almost like telling me you're an IRS agent. It's like to stay away from that person. But I do want people to get to know. I mean, you're kind of a Renaissance man in my view because, well, most of us methods guys get a bad rap for being kind of one-sided. Like we have no personality or what have you, but you kind of strike me as somebody with a lot of different interests. Like you're rather well-rounded. Yeah.
Well, yeah. What do I do? So, well, I think I'm Nigerian, so I think that plays a big impact.
I know you play football.
Well, yeah, I play. Yeah, well, that's Nigerian. So yeah, let's talk about football. Right? I try to play football. On weekends, I play football, video games. So it's funny. There's a game. I have 700 hours on it, and the game came out in October 23. So, yeah. Seven-
Wow.
and that's so I play video games. I watch a lot of TV shows, different countries, English language. Right now, I'm watching a British one. Watch a lot of Chinese, Korean shows, and well, also I'm involved in like labor unions, both in Nigeria and in the US.
Oh, really?
Sometimes, yeah, I've been on a couple of picket lines in the US. Just all over. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You are a little bit more well-rounded than I imagined. That's interesting. Well,
Yeah.
you and I both being methodologists, it's kind of an odd business to be in, honestly, because, we sort of lurk behind the scenes in education research, trying to develop and support basically the tools that people use to do their education research. We work on the research designs. I work on like measures. There's statistics that people work on, like propensity scores and things like that, and these are the tools that other researchers use to really get what I would consider to be the real work done in education research. So I'm curious, what do you kind of see as your role in the larger frame of education research as a methodologist, like generally speaking?
Yeah. It's interesting because with the work I do, I could be in a variety of departments, really. But generally, I try to, well, there's work I do that's, at some level, it's mostly about what interests me. And so sometimes I'm not sure what the larger connection is to what real things in the world. And then there's other work I do where I think, hey, here's a good approach that might help someone in certain situations answer questions that they may not even realize they have. So here's a method that's somewhat useful, but to actually implement the method can be technically challenging. Well, you need to write code, you need to do this, you need to do that. So one thing I enjoy, I have an undergrad and a master's in information systems. So something I enjoy is building tools that researchers can use with real world data. So a complex model, difficult to implement. I try to do some of that difficult work. I like programming, so it's fun.
Yeah.
So
You've
try
written
and
a few
build a
pieces
tool.
of software.
Yeah. And release the tool to see if it can help people in their work. And another thing that I think has some relevance to people's work is how do we communicate effects generally? So you might say some variables, motivation is related to how students do in schools. You might make this general comment. You do a study and a statistical study gives you a number or a collection of numbers, and now you have to interpret those numbers. And something that interests me a lot is how do we interpret these numbers to people who haven't been indoctrinated into our statistical world with all the jargon and lingo. How do you explain a correlation, for example, to someone who's not taking a statistical class? So this is something else I do that interests me, and I've worked with researchers sometimes to see how do we communicate these results in clean, clear English.
Yeah.
And I also try to emphasize that in some of the classes I teach. How do we communicate clearly? That's the goal.
Yeah, I don't think we do that nearly enough in our instruction and in our research. Try to make sure that our findings are clearly practical and applicable for people. I've always appreciated the idea of effects and effect sizes as opposed to, looking for statistical significance because, just because something's statistically significant doesn't really mean it's practically significant, But knowing that effect, and then I think what that when people interpret effect sizes, you may interpret an effect size completely different from the way I would interpret an effect size, right? I could say the Cohen's D is 0.25, and you would be like, well, that's pretty tiny. And for me, maybe I'm working in second language learning or
Yeah.
something like that. And I'm like, that's a pretty big effect
Yes.
size in our area. If we could generate that for all kinds of students,
Yes.
we'd be pretty lucky, you know. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, even, for example, the language of Cohen's D, you already need to be familiar with some
Yeah.
type of research to interpret Cohen's D. But if there's a test, for example, that everyone in the state takes, and on that test people are talking in percentiles, then maybe
Yeah.
to talk to those people we should talk about, well, this intervention moves people up about 2 percentile points on average, you know. Then maybe that's more familiar to them, and they can then judge, does 2 percentile points matter in terms of the larger context of what we are studying?
Yeah.
You know, sometimes people have benchmarks, and well, 2 percentage points get us to some benchmark that we've determined for our institution. So it's really interesting. We have the standardized effect sizes that we use, and those are generic, and sometimes you then even need to go beyond that, so like grounding it in the context that someone is working in, which can be difficult sometimes. Yeah.
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 True. Okay, so you talk about you talk about the context, and you mentioned your background in information systems. So you have, I think you've got a master's degree in maybe a bachelor's too in information systems. So how did that get you into doing educational research work?
So yeah, I mean, I like programming. Well, it's funny. If you leave me with a computer and the internet, and I don't have to talk to, I do enjoy talking to people, but I'd also be fine if I just had a computer and the internet for like days on end. So because I enjoy programming, I like writing code, and when I was doing my master's, I felt a bit removed from real world challenges, things that had to do with the real world. In tech, there's this we're always creating new things every time, every day, every time. That's how you keep your interest. But at some point, even that, I struggle to keep my interest with that. You know, this idea that we are developing a new software, we are developing a new system, or there's a new framework to work with, and everybody has to upskill on this framework, and we go to another new framework. It's at some point, it gets kind of uninteresting. And I was thinking, well, what's the connection to anything real in this world? So I think I had an undergrad advisor who had a company, and they would do large-scale interventions sometimes in public administration. So testing some interventions in the healthcare system or in the educational system. And because of this work they used to do, he turned me on to the work by they have this lab. I think it's the J. Powell lab at MIT, Esther Duflo, Albert Banerjee, and they focus on large-scale cluster randomized trials, basically. So that was interesting to me because the idea back then was, well, we could approach small problems and try to develop interventions for those problems and see how well they work, evaluate them. So that was what brought me into the field. But it's interesting, over the course of my study, I moved away from that. Now I mostly focus on modeling, but it was my interest in cluster randomized trials and their potential for public impact. That's how I used to think back then, and that's what brought me into the field. But I don't really do that these days.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know you got involved with the cluster randomized trial idea. That's that's very endemic to the kind of problems that we deal with in education, because almost everything we deal with is people are involved in groups and clusters,
Yes.
you know.
Yes.
So what is it about education in particular that makes research interesting?
So I think for me it's hard.
It
That's
is.
what makes it interesting. It's hard. It's really hard.
I think Dave Berliner said it was the hardest science of all.
Yes,
or something.
it is very hard. Because I'll try and approach this from my narrow angle. So in education, what I focus on a lot is measurement, psychometrics. How do we measure things? So that might seem easy. For example, if you want to get the body temperature, you stick a thermometer in someone's mouth or in their armpits, and you get their body temperature. But so that's easy. But in education, we're talking about things like a student's motivation or a student's level of math ability.
Yeah, you can't see that.
These are things you can't see. There are no simple instruments. These values sometimes fluctuate. You know, your motivation can vary from hour to hour. Someone might say something and you're very pumped up, and then someone else motivates you and it goes down. It's really hard. And then you're talking about children sometimes, you know, like development of children and how to like go into a child's brain and get their level of motivation. That can be really, really difficult. You can imagine that fluctuates a whole lot. So I think the difficulty, even if you just focus on measurement, how do we understand the level at which a person is on some traits of interest, on some construct of interest, makes it quite interesting to me.
Yeah, to me too. I also find that really fascinating that we think we can measure these things that we just agree intellectually that they exist, like self-efficacy.
Yes.
I think we all kind of know what self-efficacy is, but your definition of it may vary a little bit from mine, which may vary a little bit from Tapaswini's and somebody else's, and then we think we can measure it accurately and interpret it the same way is not necessarily the case. Yeah, well. Let's move into some of your other more advanced work. So some of your work, like I know you do a lot of structural equation modeling, but some of your work focuses on Bayesian structural equation models. So can you really explain, I don't know if you can do this, but I'm going to put you on the spot. It's like, can you explain what a structural equation model is and why it's useful in education research, first of all?
Okay. Let me try this. So in research, it's really common to try and understand relations between variables. So very, very simple. Generally, people who are taller will have more weights, larger weights. So we would say that's a positive relation because on average, people who are taller weigh more. So we have interest in studying these things. These are very common kinds of questions. How do variables relate together? What are these patterns? So that's a broad area of, that's a very common type of question. The standard methods for this are, say, things like correlation analysis or regression analysis. But built into this standard approaches is the idea that the variables we are measuring them without error. So if you're looking at height and weight, well, you can have pretty good measurements of height and weight. You know, tape rule, the machine.
Yeah, because we can see it, right? Yeah.
Yes, but if you're interested in looking at, say, self-efficacy and math knowledge or math perseverance, you know, this now it's really hard to measure these concepts without error. And this is what structural equation modeling as a whole tries to help with. How do we get out the relations between variables while accounting for the fact that measurement is hard to do? That's the underlying, from my perspective, the underlying substantive contribution of structural equation modeling.
Okay. So let's go a little further. Yeah. First of all, how does the Bayesian statistics differ from traditional, like, frequentist approaches? And then how do you combine it with SEM?
Got it. Okay. So generally within structural equation modeling, I mostly use Bayesian structural equation modeling. So these are Bayesian approaches to structural equation modeling. What is Bayesian? At a simple level, when we do data analysis, quantitative data analysis, we have data that you collect, and you want to learn from the data. And we also have some formula, some system that allows us to extract the information in the data. So technically, people might say a likelihood, but you have data that you want to learn from, and you have some formulas that you're working with that allow you to extract certain information in that data. This, and then you do that and you come up with some new state of knowledge. You have learned something. That's the point of doing research.
Mm-hmm.
For a Bayesian approach, we don't think research starts with, or analysis starts with, I have data and I'm going to apply some formula and learn from that data. We think you already have some preconceived notions, some preconceived ideas about the patterns in that data. We would call this priors. Some people might say prior beliefs. So imagine two different researchers have the same data.
Mm-hmm.
They might have different prior beliefs because maybe they represent different strands in their different theoretical orientations in their fields. As a Bayesian, within a Bayesian approach, we think there is some benefits to incorporating that prior belief, that starting position into the analysis as a way to update a state of knowledge. So we don't just start the analysis from information in the data, apply some formula. We say information in the data, apply some formula, but also bring in your original beliefs into the process. And this leads into this idea of subjectivity. There are approaches to Bayesian that are more objective. There are principled ways of capturing those original prior beliefs, because in truth, you could use this concept to produce completely false,
very biased information.
Yes.
You could bias your
yes,
studies
you could really
for sure. by selecting a prior
yes,
that is
yes. If your prior is ridiculous, then you could if your prior is, I think this intervention improves students' grades by 50 points and the whole test is 0 to 100. That's a ridiculous prior belief. So but the point is, you also would likely have to defend this prior belief if you're trying to contribute to a shared science. Science is not just you and your individual state of knowledge. So there are principled ways of capturing these prior beliefs and incorporating them into the analysis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move a little bit further, and let's get really down to specifics. So, can you kind of give us an example or two of a question that is in educational research where a BSEM is particularly well suited to that question?
How about I just give one where Bayesian analysis is well suited?
Okay.
Would that work also?
Let's try that first.
So let's say you have this an intervention. And this intervention has been deployed in many contexts, in many different settings. So we have a good sense of how well this intervention works. For a particular test, it usually improves students' grades by about 5 points.
Mm-hmm.
We've looked at this in one school district, in say 10 different school districts. In some school districts, it moved the needle maybe by 0 points. In some, it moved them by as much as 15 points.
Okay.
So there's quite a bit of variation in how this intervention works, and we are aware of that information.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So here I'm trying to test the same intervention in my small school, and I don't have many people. I have 15 kids in one group that don't get the intervention, and another 15 that get the intervention.
Yep.
Now, if you use your regular statistical approach, your traditional approach to this,
you're underpowered.
Yeah, you don't have much information in that data to start with, because 15 is not a lot to base inference on, especially given the amount of noise we find in educational research. Some of these methods were developed in beer production, agriculture, where you can have sample sizes of 3, 4, and those conditions are pretty precise. Here we're talking about 15 kids, and those 15 kids, the day you test them, something could be going on.
Yeah.
Everything it's really hard. So the level of precision is much lower. The level of confidence we can have from small samples is much lower. So in this situation, we already know quite a bit about how this intervention works, the range of effects it has. We would this kind of scenario would be great for a Bayesian approach.
So you have
Because-
to document that prior information well,
Yes.
though,
Yes.
for people to believe that your prior is
Yes.
reasonable.
Yes. Yes. If you're trying to show that, okay, this intervention, let's study this intervention in this context, but I have some prior information and I want to use it, but I also want to be principled and somewhat objective about this. Then I go gathering that prior information and I incorporate it into the analysis. It's basically a way of adding more data to the data we have at hand. That's what the prior does for you.
So really, the Bayesian approach, it's more efficient, or it drives efficiencies because you don't need necessarily big, because not all studies avail themselves to provide big sample sizes that you might like for a frequentist approach to analyze the data. And here, using the prior information, you end up with more efficient, or you get it with these
Yes.
efficiencies.
Yes, yes. So if you're familiar with some of these analyses, you get an estimate of the effect. Maybe if you do a traditional analysis, you might say this intervention improves student scores by 4 points on average, with some standard error, which communicates the uncertainty. With a Bayesian approach, the final standard error you get is likely to be smaller. It's likely to be more precise. Our uncertainty is reduced. So that's this point of efficiency, because we are not just relying on the present data, we are also incorporating past results into our analysis.
Yeah, I think I refer to it as efficiency because for people who are working in schools,
Yes.
this is a really efficient approach to do a study, because if they take into consideration the prior information that we have, they don't need to involve multiple classrooms or schools in their study. They can basically find out what they want to know about how the intervention works in their particular population without assessing the whole population or that many sample or
Yes.
sampling units.
You can be much more efficient with a Bayesian approach generally, especially when you have richer prior information. Then you can become even more efficient. When you have almost no prior information, then a Bayesian approach doesn't do much for you. For at least as a selling point, it doesn't do much for you. But when you have a wealthy prior information, maybe you've seen this implemented in multiple places, it can really help with reducing the costs practically in your present study. And it's not just the efficiency, it's also the fluency with which you can discuss your results. So when you do statistics in a very in your traditional frequentist null hypothesis significance testing approach, the usual way we teach statistics, when you do statistics that way, you will come up with quantities like p-values and confidence intervals. And these quantities have relatively precise definitions. In practice, we have to stretch them. We have to stretch them beyond what the mathematics of these methods precisely allow for us to do. With the Bayesian approach, one of the advantages is on the back end, you put in all that effort in providing the rich prior information. On the back end, you also have increased flexibility in how you can talk about your results. So an example is with the Bayesian approach, a quantity you get at the back end is the posterior distribution. But let me demonstrate an example of how it might be useful. With a posterior distribution, you get a sense of the range of potential effects of an intervention. So we can ask questions. What is the chance this intervention improves my student scores by 10 points? And from the posterior distribution, you can get a percentage, 2%. And some might be like, I only care about a 10-point improvement, 2% is not worth my time. Someone else might say, I only care about a 4 point improvements, and we can ask from that posterior distribution, what's the chance my intervention improves results by 4 points? And for that person, maybe the answer is 97%, and they're like, this is for me. So different people can interpret the results in different ways based on what they are looking for, based on their standards, their thresholds for practical significance. So it's you have more flexibility on the back end in terms of how we can use the inference you gain from a Bayesian analysis.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, let's switch though.
Okay.
So, what challenges? I mean, researchers when they're using Bayesian structural models, for example, like what are the challenges to using them, and what do you have to do to overcome those challenges?
Okay. So this question there were more challenges, say 5 years ago or 10 years ago than there are now. A big challenge is software. So if you want to do your regular analysis, you say open SPSS, or if you don't use SPSS, R, Stata, SAS, and well, you point and click the settings and you get results out. With a Bayesian analysis, usually you don't have easy software options to just use in the same way. That's changing these days. So, for example, M+, expensive software, you can use M+ for a Bayesian analysis. There are also open source software like a Blavan in R, which makes it easy to do a Bayesian structural equation model. So on the software end, it's getting easier to run these models. But a challenge that everyone trying to do a Bayesian analysis has is, how do I set the prior? Because at the end of the day, the prior is going to be some mathematical concept. The information researchers have is not a mathematical concept that you can drill down to like specific numbers in very precise ways. Our knowledge is usually more human, more fluid than 0.4. 2.9. But a prior is ultimately a collection of numbers like 0.432 and 6.597. It's precise information. So how do you set that precise information? That's one of the big challenges. Even if you have the software to work with, how do we set it? How do we even learn it? That's hard. So these days there's more work in this area of prior elicitation, and the general idea is, how do we turn rich contextual knowledge that researchers have into precise mathematical quantities. So that's this field of prior elicitation, and there are people working in it, developing software that even researchers can use to try and transform their rich knowledge into the mathematical quantities that are priors. So I think software is one challenge, but that's getting easier. And the other big challenge is prior elicitation. How do we transform knowledge that we have into mathematical quantities? And it's hard. It's a hard challenge, but it's also interesting.
I will put a cheap plug in here for our Office of Research Consulting, because you mentioned the limitation with the software. We have M+, and we have the these workstations now in the ORC, where if you are a researcher and you're out there and or even if you're a practitioner wanting to know more about this, we have the capabilities to support researchers with some of that stuff in our office. So. I mean, I do recall you saying that, SEM is essentially a regression model, and I agree with you on that, but, and I've asked you this question before, I'm going to ask you again. So how are we able to we're looking at correlational kinds of things.
Yes.
We could talk about what a correlation is if you want, but you've got these cross-sectional data, and you're looking at these relationships among these latent variables, let's say, in an SEM model. But how are you able to make causal inferences with these things? In other words, how do I how can I estimate a causal effect with this kind of cross-sectional data by applying SEM or even BSEM?
Okay. Yeah, it's that's a difficult one. At a base level, I think we all learn that cause and effect comes from design, not analysis. So if you're interested
for
in
that,
cause
yeah.
and effect, you design an experiment or you come up with a situation that allows you to reduce as much of the factors that make it difficult to say
The
A
confounders, yeah.
causes B. Yes. But not everyone has that luxury. Sometimes we cannot do experiments. One of my professors used to joke that you cannot do experiments with parachutes.
Right, yeah.
You can't do
Yeah, that would
experiments.
really be a bad idea.
Yes. Or you cannot do experiment. It was really hard for a long time, for example, to prove that the relation between, say, smoking and cancer, because, well, you cannot randomly say, hey, you smoke,
smoke or
hey,
you
you don't
don't.
smoke. That's really not how it works. So sometimes we do have to estimate, we have to identify causal effects with data that are not designed for that specific goal. And so it's hard, but I think I think a lot of the difficulty when we have this challenge, I think a promising approach is in rich theoretical understanding of the patterns in data and building the science slowly. So in SCM, we see these things called path diagrams, and they can be scary. You know, people are drawing arrows between variables, and this affects this, and this affects this, and this affects this. Those are theoretical ideas of the ways variables affect
The
each
relationships,
other. Yeah, and if a path diagram is correct, you don't necessarily need a time component to estimate causal patterns. If it is indeed correct, you don't. You can estimate causal patterns from observational data. So how do you know a path diagram is correct? And, well, it gets very hard. If you have a very complex path diagram filled with all kinds of things, the only way you can be confident in that is a very, very deep theory that's probably been developed over decades. To me, it's kind of fraudulent to be starting out in a very young field with complex path diagrams and think you can test them. You want to start from the simple relations. Where possible, design experiments or crafty little tricks that help you identify causal effects. So you want to start small and build the science cumulatively. So the point where you can draw elaborate systems that reflects the understanding, the theoretical understanding, and begin to test them. SCM has tools that allow us to test these relations, these complex relations. However, the tools only tell you certain mathematical things. They don't tell you cause effects identified. You can't get there just from statistics and observational data. So I think a slow approach to science where you build understandings, okay, this causes this, using a number of experiments, preferably across a wide variety of researchers. And then you build that cumulatively. So to me, having rich understanding of systems of cause and effect is decades-long work involving multiple researchers. A single SCM, I think that's asking too much from statistics.
I think it is too. I was going to ask you a question. I'm not sure I know the answer to, because I know you've recently been appointed to a committee for the What Works Clearinghouse, right? You the meta-analytic.
Yeah, I'm on a working group.
Yeah, on a working group. And even the WWC standards, like the standards guide. I mean, you don't see any discussion in there about using structural equation models for making causal inferences in there. They don't. That's not an acceptable approach, right?
No. So it's interesting because For that, I think a lot of the studies that the guide focuses on are on those very basic blocks, A to B, just A
Yeah.
to B, not complete systems of A to B, B to C, D to Y, X, nothing complex. They're usually on those basic blocks. And that information is good. But at some point, human beings want more than A to B and B to C. We think in like rich, complex systems.
Yeah.
So ideally, this when we are doing this kind of science, we should be building up the complexity. Where possible, carry out interventions. Where not, do there are many tricks you can do with observational data to identify causal effects. So you have things like the discontinuity, regression
Right.
discontinuity. There are a number of techniques that allow you to isolate cause-effect relations from observational
Yeah.
data. So I think we build up these structures, and the more you build them, then you can start to test and examine elaborate systems. I'm really recently I've become more interested in the idea of directed acyclic graphs. So it's this
I don't know
approach.
about this at all.
It comes out of I would say computer science. A little
Okay, that's why
Judea
I don't know
Pell.
about, yeah.
I think he's part computer scientist, part biostatistician. I may be wrong about his background. But it creates a language for thinking about systems of variables and how they interrelate with each other. So we can precisely identify what's a confounder. There's also something called a collider. There's something called mediators. These are specific ways that variables interrelate with each other.
Sounds also like using variables as instruments,
Variables as instruments.
like an
Instrumental variable.
estimation.
Within a DAG, you can have an instrumental variable setup.
Yeah.
But it basically allows us to say, here's the entire system of variables that I think that allows me to estimate some causal relation. And a DAG guides you to identifying potential problems in that system and potential claims you are making. When you connect two things together, what does that say about the connection between some other two things? So when you have this collection of claims that you are making explicitly, the DAG helps you identify the claims you are making implicitly. Some of these we can test with data analysis, but it also helps you design studies prospectively, observational studies to test causal relations. So it's really hard. At the end of the day, if there's some large takeaway message, I would say when you do science, be cautious.
Yeah, always.
Don't be too bold. And the larger the claims you are making, the less confident you should be generally. Other advice I would say, do work with large groups of people where possible. If you're really interested in a particular relation, test it with a sample that's available to you, yes. But also see if you can invite other people to test the same thing.
Good advice.
In different samples, potentially even with different measurement instruments, because different people conceptualize constructs slightly differently.
Absolutely, yeah. As
So
we've already mentioned, yeah.
Then we build a broad, that's how we get towards more generalizable insights. We identify ranges within which certain relations hold. One thing builds on the other, and slowly we can start to get into more complex systems of relationships.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, we could go on for a while here, but what's next for you? What's exciting now for you? What are you working on these days?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm here telling people to be cautious, but I think for me, I'm working on methods that. Try to push beyond the caution. I think it's fine for me to work on things that maybe are a few years ahead of what I think people should actually be doing and place confidence in. So something I'm working on that I find interesting these days is meta-analytic SEMs.
Yeah.
And the idea is basically using SEMs to learn relations between variable, but across multiple studies. So it combines meta-analysis with SEM. So meta-analysis is across you usually have data from multiple studies and you're trying to learn a pattern. With meta-analytic SCM, you're trying to learn an entire system of variable relations across using data from multiple studies. So that's something I've been working on recently.
Man, how do you do that? I mean, you've got like all the studies aren't going to specify the exact same relationships in the different structural models.
Yes. So it can be hard sometimes. There's an
It can
easy
be
situation.
impossible.
So there's an easy situation. An easy situation is if you're doing this for instruments. For example, you're trying to look at how well an instrument functions and you're using data from multiple studies.
Okay.
Because it's a single instrument, chances are everyone is asking the same questions. So a sample in Alabama or to a sample in, I don't know, Washington or to a sample in Tokyo. Everyone is asking the same questions, maybe across different languages. That's easy. It's when you're looking at relations between variables.
Yeah.
Person A is looking at A to B, person B is looking at C to Y. Well, that you basically have a missing data problem.
Yeah.
And missing data methods apply in that context.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a missing data problem,
It's
and we
just
can
a whole missing study.
whole missing
Or whole set of
patterns.
studies.
Yes. So
Yeah,
missing
okay.
data methods can become useful in that context. So that's something that's interesting to me, and I'm also trying to get into a single subject research.
Okay. Yeah.
Megan Rojo, who is also an assistant professor like me in a special education, and I have a submission under review. And we're basically trying to use some Bayesian methods to estimate patterns in single case studies and provide effects that's they call them non-overlap measures. If you're familiar with single case studies, you might have a collection of cases, people, and you're trying to modify their behavior. So you intervene on each person and you track their behavior to see if it changes. Sometimes you withdraw the intervention, see if they go back to how they were before.
Yeah.
You introduce it again, see if it changes. And so there are several measures that try to capture how confident can we be that someone's behavior has changed. And you can imagine usually these studies are short. So you might measure someone 12 times or 20 times. And now you're trying to conclude from just 20 measurements of a single person. And that's really hard to do, especially if you're trying to do it.
It's hard to generalize from
confidence.
That. Yeah.
Usually single case researchers will not try and generalize because it's case specific. But being confident about a case is hard to do.
Yeah.
So we are looking at some methods that try to... It's a Bayesian approach. It's called hierarchical modeling, where we try and... The basic idea is if you have several children in a study, every child is unique, every case is unique. But there's also something they all share, such that information about... If you have 4 children, information from 3 children might tell you something about the 4th child. And we can use that information to improve the estimates for the 4th child. So that's the basic idea of what we are looking at. And I mean, I think single case research is really interesting, and because the data are small, sometimes the researchers have rich contextual background information. I think it's a great study design to use Bayesian methods with. So that's something I'm kind of excited to explore over the next few years.
That's
Wow,
that's advanced stuff.
That's a lot of information for me here today, and to the people who watched this actually.
Yeah.
I hope I did a decent job explaining certain things and not...
No, we got to leave something for your courses. Something for you to talk about in class.
I mean, the statistical methods you have mentioned, I think what we spoke today, that would help the newbies maybe to go through their research and start their works.
Okay.
That should be a lot of information for me today.
Okay, good. I mean, and also, like, I like talking to people. Emails from people I've never met.
Yeah.
Great. I receive emails all the time, and I'm always happy to respond to emails until I get tired of responding. But you probably need to send me like 50 emails before that happens. So yeah.
I can't wait to take your class.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Well, yeah. Thanks for joining us today and sharing all this stuff. I mean, it was a pleasure. I don't think I sat down and talked to you in this much depth before about what you're working on. And thank you, Tapaswini, for getting this pod going today with James. If you're listening out there, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to share this or give us a like on our YouTube channel. Share this with other people who you think might find this interesting. If you're interested in joining our Trend Network, we're going to put a link below this pod video so you can fill out the form. It's completely free to join. And we'd love to see you at our next monthly Trend meeting. We're trying to hold meetings once a month, just last for an hour here on campus, with kind of a priority on letting people interact and get to know one another so that researchers and practitioners can strike up conversations, find people that they're interested in working with. We never know, we might get James there, who knows. But yeah, the meetings just last an hour. But we do try to have somebody come in and give a short presentation. I really am excited to tell you that I hope you'll join us on the next episode of The Learning Curve for North Texas, because we're going to have a really special guest coming in from the Charles Butt Foundation. Will be joining us, Mr. Kurt Lockhart, and we're going to be talking about two topics that they've done some data collection on, and they've done some surveys. One is on the Texas STAR test and what people's opinions are on that, which I think will be kind of fascinating. And then the results from a poll they've done on teachers in Texas and what they need. So should be super interesting. But with that, thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Tapaswini, for pulling this together. And James, really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
It was awesome.
I mean, it's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, maybe we have you back and do part 2, huh?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. All right. Until then, take care and stay on the North Texas Learning Curve. We'll be back with another episode soon.